Japan today marking 80 years since the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. An estimated 140,000 people died as a result of this bombing. Some consider the destruction of the city, coupled with the subsequent nuclear attack on Nagasaki days later, to have played a part in Japan's eventual surrender in World War II. The tolling of a bell at 8:15 a.m. local time at Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park. At the very moment the bomb exploded above the city in 1945. A record number of representatives attended this year's memorial, including Taiwanese and Palestinian officials. Prominent nuclear powers, though, such as Russia, China and Pakistan, were not present. The Japanese Prime Minister repeating his government's pledge to work towards a world without weapons of mass destruction.
広島、長崎にもたらされた惨禍を決して繰り返してはなりません。非核三原則を堅持しながら、核兵器のない世界に向けた国際社会の取り組みを主導することは、唯一の戦争被爆国である我が国の使命であります。
Across the river, the iconic atomic bomb dome, serving as a reminder of the horrors of nuclear war. Some survivors of the blast, with numbers falling with each passing year, have turned their experiences into very personal missions to educate future generations. Earlier, hundreds of anti-war protesters gathered at the Peace Memorial Park, calling for the abolition of atomic weapons, while voicing opposition to the Japanese leaders' earlier advocacy of nuclear sharing. Now, that's to introduce weapons like these into the region as a form of deterrence. Professor Ren Zoggenberg from Pennsylvania State University examined the likelihood of tensions on security driving nations to take the nuclear option.
A war between nuclear powers is something which is less likely, but as long as we have thousands of weapons and Harry Trigger alert, something like this can happen. We had what's called in genre broken arrow, or almost accidental use or accidents involving nuclear weapons, and we had a whole bunch of them during the Cold War. In case of tactical use, this may happen, but a nuclear taboo, which Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the peace movement is very much responsible for, and this is for me the biggest achievement of the movement that is based and came out of Hiroshima, Nagasaki.
One individual who has been involved in these movements based and coming out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is Professor Yuki Miyamoto from DePaul University. She's also director of the DePaul Humanities Center. Dr. Miyamoto, 2 decades spent on these movements to promote the idea of not using nuclear weapons in this world. What we just heard from that expert saying he sees the biggest achievement of movements like yours is the maintaining of this taboo on the use of nuclear weapons. Do you see that taboo still holding? And for you, is that the greatest achievement?
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I must say that it is nice to hear that nuclear taboo has been maintained by people who have worked for anti-nuclear movement or abolishing nuclear weapons. But I am not quite certain or confident that this nuclear taboo is holding up itself. And I think nowadays, even in Japan, there are some discussions going on that Japan should possess nuclear weapons for its own sake, for the protection. And so given that, I feel like the nuclear taboo, we cannot rely on nuclear taboo, but we have to establish a theory to deconstruct the nuclear deterrence theory.
All right, establishing this theory, I think you were at the commemoration ceremony today in Hiroshima, where the city mayor gave his speech in which he warned of an accelerating trend towards military build-up around the world. So this, I take it, is what you're referring to. In other words, suggesting that the trend towards maintaining this taboo on using nuclear weapons, that might in fact be weakening.
Yes, I'm afraid so. And also this commemoration has been organized by the city. So even though PM Ishiba came and delivered speech, but main agency of this ceremony is Hiroshima City Mayor and also Governor Yuzaki, Hiroshima Governor Yuzaki. He also delivered a speech. And they have more, especially what Mayor Matsui mentioned, the U.S. and Russia have 90% of nuclear weapons currently existing on our planet. And in front of or in the presence of the representatives of each country, and also asking the Japanese government to be present at the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So this is a kind of moment that city mayor, municipal government can make its own goal and made clear of its own agenda. And Governor Yuzaki also criticized the nuclear deterrence theory very clearly.
All right, a single weapon could wipe out millions. We've got more than 12,000 in the hands of, you mentioned US and Russia, but we've got 9 such nuclear powers. So not just the US, Russia, but smaller powers, which ironically might feel less constrained to use those powers. So this message that you have been trying to spread for nigh on 2 decades, or more than 2 decades, in fact, you have lamented in the past your suspicion that it is failing to resonate, that you need to bring it down from the abstract to humanize this message. Are you managing to do that?
Thank you for asking. I think it is important to talk about nuclear weapons in the context of national security or diplomatic concerns and relationships between the nation states. But at the same time, it can be very abstract. And what I would like to do is, following Governor Yuzaki's speech, I also have been criticizing nuclear deterrence theory, because nuclear deterrence theory is that nuclear weapons have protected us, right? And I just wondered, who are we referring to us? Let's say I've been living in Chicago for close to 30 years, and the US alone has conducted a nuclear test 1,030 times in its territory. And the Nevada test site, the US has conducted over 900 nuclear tests. And at the Marshall Islands, which became independent in 1986, but before that, since 1946, 67 nuclear tests have been conducted, including hydrogen bombs, which is equivalent to receiving 12 Hiroshima bombs almost every day. So given that, you might wonder if nuclear weapons have actually protecting whom, right? And the Marshall Islands back then were US territories, and Nevada, of course, people are living there in downwind areas. So I think nuclear deterrence theory is coming from those who believe that nuclear weapons are protecting us. But those people who have been harmed by the nuclear weapons and tests and productions, uranium mining, all those concerning production of nuclear weapons, they have been harmed, they have been injured, and nuclear weapons clearly have not protected them. So right. That's one way.
Pardon me for cutting in, Professor Miyamoto. A final question here. I understand what you're saying. So weapons testing in itself is harmful. But of course, the even greater danger, for example, a high-yield bomb now, awful to use these terms, but a high-yield bomb now is 80 times the size of the bomb that hit Hiroshima 80 years ago. And you have a very personal experience from that bombing. In fact, it directly both your mother as well as your cousin, who had not even at that point been born. How do you translate for you a very personal and genuine human suffering to countries who will then quote back at you, and so William Blake saying, mutual fear brings peace? Final question.
Right. So having experienced, I was born and grew up in Hiroshima, and my mom was 6 years old, a mile away from the hypocenter. And she didn't tell me about her experience, partly because she didn't want to revisit it, because it's not, pleasant. And also some hibakusha, referring to those people who are affected by the bomb. Hibakusha unfortunately faced discrimination from the fellow Japanese citizens. So she didn't want to hand down that kind of negative impact on me. But as far as I remember, she had menial disease in her 30s, and in her 40s, she was not able to produce healthy blood cells. So she had to get blood booster shots every other week. And in her 50s, she was diagnosed with cancer, and several years later, she passed away. So I have witnessed the slow death. And she was only 6 years old. And having seen one member of the family falls ill, then it changes the entire family dynamics. And losing your loved one years later, I think no one deserves it. And I acknowledge that Japan was aggressor, and 10% of the victims in the Hiroshima bombing came from the Korean Peninsula. But so no one deserves, even so, no one deserves that kind of slow death and long-term suffering. And I think I would like to mention that, and bringing it into environmental issues. This is definitely environmental issues, because the plutonium's half-life is 24,000 years. And also gender issues, economic issues. We are paying so much in Chicago or in the United States in order to maintain nuclear weapons. So I would like to talk about, this is not only United Nations or diplomatic concerns, but also our everyday life. It concerns our everyday life.
Thanks, Professor Yuki Miyamoto. Thanks for that. So in fact, the death toll from Hiroshima is not just, and just is I use it very lightly, 140,000. The toll spreads much more beyond that. Professor Yuki Miyamoto from DePaul University, thanks for joining us.